Hello, all, and welcome to this next session of the Day of the Climate Professional. It is my privilege and my distinct honor to quickly present this panel. Very excited as this topic is near and dear to me personally. So the future of climate education. And as we all know, it starts there. So when we're talking about climate professionals, we're talking about those very professionals that are then therein teaching the future climate professionals, and really instigating and setting the foundation for the future. So to get this started, I'd like to introduce our incredible moderator for this panel, Julie Gwiszcz. And let's see here. I did just mispronounce your last name. I've known you for how long? And I still cannot pronounce it. So quickly, with Julie to my side, I'd love to introduce, just give a little bit of an introduction, well-deserved introduction to Julie here. Julie is a senior sustainability scientist at the university, or excuse me, at Arizona State University. Julianna has many hats. She works with us closely here at Youth Climate Leaders. She is one of our members of our academic council. She also leads the Transformative Conference series. She's a lead steward for the SDG Transformations Forum and Transforming Capacity Steward team. Julie is PhD, so Dr. Gwiszcz. She's transdisciplinary, transboundary scholar, practivist, and global edupreneur, passionate about building transformative capacity for addressing our intersecting social and ecological justice and sustainable well-being concerns. She is what she calls a boundary bridge builder and net weaver. She works at the intersections of academia and international sustainable development, human rights, and global environmental change. I could go on forever about Julie, but we don't have enough time. But Julie, I will pass it over to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Steve. And it's Gwiszcz for all of those who are curious out there. I've known Steve for several years now, and it's just precious to hear him attempt to try and pronounce that. So I'm really honored to be here tonight. I apologize, I'm a little short and my camera's not quite adjusting to the framing of this visual. So please let me know if anybody's having trouble seeing, but I am honored to be here with the 16 panelists that we have with us tonight to talk about the future of climate education. And this is a really near and dear topic to my heart as well, as Steve mentioned for himself. It's very personal, the type of work that I'm doing in transformative learning and sustainability and regeneration, and looking at not just where we are currently and how we can make that learning process along the life course more transformative, but really taking all that is happening in this point in time, all the crises we're up against, and really using that as fuel, as a catalyst for transforming the future of the way that we think about climate education, sustainability education, environmental education, whatever you want to call it. And it's evolved so many layers over the years. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. So as we jump into our conversation, I'm going to actually ask, instead of going through each of the speakers and giving them sort of this very formalized pronunciation of their incredible backgrounds, I'm going to ask each of them to do something a little bit different. And as I introduce you, to please talk about what brought you to this field, what your current role is and how it relates to climate education, and to briefly describe sort of what excites you about this moment in time regarding the future of climate education. And so I'll begin, and Steve, are you going to be adding to the screen? Because I'm only seeing myself, just so everybody knows, adding the other panelists as we go. But currently, we have with us today Dr. Andy Dosmann, and please correct me if I pronounce it wrong. And then we have Jaimie P. Cloud, who's Andy Dosmann is an associate professor of natural sciences at Minerva. Jaimie P. Cloud is the founder and president of the Cloud Institute for Sustainability Education in New York. And we have Kate Guy, who's a Doctor of Philosophy student in International Relations at the University of Oxford. And then we have a recording of a speaker who unfortunately couldn't join us due to time constraints this evening, who's from Brazil. I'm going to mispronounce her name, but Leonildes Nazar, who's the coordinator of Amazonia Urbana at the Institute of Climate and Society in Brazil. And so as we get started, I'm going to ask each of you, beginning with Andy, if again, you could just give a brief intro, kind of highlights of really what brought you to this field, what your current role is, and what excites you about this moment in time.
Yeah, good questions. So what really brought me to the field, honestly, is a love of nature. Growing up and throughout my career, always valuing that and finding a lot of importance and worth in that. And so initially working within conservation brought me to studying evolutionary biology, which is what I did my PhD in and is actually my primary current role now. So with Minerva, I'm an instructor. I teach evolutionary biology. I also teach a course called empirical analysis, which is essentially critical thinking within the sciences. And that I see has a lot of application to the current climate crisis. And also I work with Minerva, heading up our sustainability team, working with some work study students who are trying to look at our institution and how we can improve some of our practices to be more sustainable as well. What excites me right now is just the global movement that's really growing and how activated and energized young people are to really take some action. And with that growing movement, I think that really calls upon educators to step up to the plate and serve those young people to give them the tools where they can really have some impact with the action that they're trying to take.
A little bit about Minerva for those who've never heard of it before. I'm actually very new to it myself, so it's a really interesting organization.
Yeah, so Minerva is a new college. We just had our first graduating class 2 years ago. And how it operates is that students travel around the world for their 4 years, starting in San Francisco and then going to 6 other global rotation cities, with the idea that a global education is what's necessary to be a leader in today's world and, of course, the future. And that's facilitated by some online classroom software that also institutes some different ways of engagement for students that the science of learning has shown is more effective.
And again, it's a privilege to have you on today. I'm going to switch to Jaimie now. Again, if you could introduce yourself briefly, share a bit about what brought you to this field, what your current role is, and what excites you about this moment in time.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So this work for me began when I was actually in the 6th grade. I was in the first experiment in global education in 1968. So a long time ago, I was 11. And so I've been studying futurism and system dynamics and multiple perspectives and scenario planning and the state of the world data since then, since I was 11. And so fast forward, I became a global educator because I thought that was the edgiest, most 21st century thing to do. And then in 1987, the word sustainability arrived on the radar. And having tracked the state of the planet data for many years at that point, I thought, oh, I think I'm tracking unsustainability. What is sustainability? That seems like a much better idea. And how do you educate for it? And to what extent am I already doing that? And what would need to change? And then in 92, there was the big global summit. And so I founded the center in 1995, thinking I was very late. And as it turns out, I'm one of the founders of the field in the US of education for sustainability, which I didn't know at the time because we didn't even have internet yet. And so my role at this point is twofold. I work as a consultant and a professional developer with school systems. We do a lot of curriculum design and professional learning and coaching, leadership development and organizational change, and thought leadership. So those are the two things that I'm doing right now at the Cloud Institute with school districts and schools and some schools of education, but very few. I wish there were more. And what's exciting me, I agree with Andy, the movement of young people who are awake and interested in this work is very exciting. And I'm particularly excited too about Drawdown. If you don't know about Drawdown, it's drawdown.org. Mathematicians from all over the world who have been working on what it's going to take to reverse global warming and in our lifetimes. And so I'm very excited about that.
And now I'm going to switch over to Kate Guy, the Doctor of Philosophy student. Kate, do we have you here? I know you're having computer problems. Kate.
Hi there. Sorry, my Wi-Fi and computer have been completely going in and out. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Julianna, do you mind just repeating that last bit? I think it cut out for me.
So just a brief introduction into what brought you to this field. So you can even talk about your journey to doing your PhD, what your current role is, and what excites you about this moment in time.
Sure thing. Thank you. Thanks so much. Just moved house, so still getting the Wi-Fi up and running, unfortunately, but it seems like it's working now. So yeah, I mean, my background is one in which at a pretty young age, I decided that I wanted to figure out this crazy problem of climate change and dive into it. And being the daughter and granddaughter and great-granddaughter of teachers, education has actually always really been crucial to that story for me. So I wanted to study and learn everything that I could about climate change. I think an experience that mirrors a lot of young people today, especially from what I see. So I pursued that actually through the realm not of science, but through politics. And so pursued a degree in international relations and political science, understanding that if we really want to do anything about this problem, it's going to take knowing how to actually change the levers of policy and of power. And in my perception, sort of really doing that in a global way was of paramount importance. So I was very lucky to be able to have a great bachelor's and master's program that really exposed me to the whole realm of international relations, not just climate, and was lucky to sort of myself be able to specialize in climate change in spaces that offered it, sort of in New York. When that came to sort of think about further schooling for me, I actually did something which is something I tell all of my students these days, which is really wanted to go and work in the real world and understand how these problems, especially in a political capacity and international capacity, play out on the ground. And I think that's something that is incredibly important for one's education in the realm, to actually be able to not just think about things theoretically, but think about them practically. It makes you sort of understand trade-offs and understand complex policy and political issues way better than just studying them in a classroom. And I'm glad I did that sort of before going into the PhD program, because I think it gave me, unlike a lot of people that sort of go straight through academia and are always sort of buried deep in the literature, it gave me networks of people to turn to and ideas and conferences and things like that to actually be there sort of on the ground interacting with people, and that has been really important to the PhD. Now, what I want to say sort of beyond just if you're interested in academia, that's great, but something that I find since coming into a PhD program is I'm teaching a lot. So I'm teaching both graduates and undergraduates. And something that has really struck me about climate change, especially in a university context these days, is there's actually a pretty dire and big generational gap. I find this especially true in sort of the political sciences and social sciences, but it's probably even true a bit on the more natural sciences side as well. There is just an immense demand from students to learn about this problem and to learn about it from every which way, right? People that are studying French want to learn about climate change as it relates to the Francophone world. People studying philosophy want to think about sort of the interaction between humans and nature and what that means from a philosophical perspective. I can't think of any discipline that I know that I've not encountered students that want to study climate change. The problem is in most of those academic departments, that it has not been prioritized that people know anything about, let alone climate change, anything environmental, just because of the sort of devaluation of that subject matter across many disciplines for many years. So I am sort of constantly witnessing this demand from students and frankly lack of supply from universities, or sort of scramble from universities to offer what students need. And I think it's a good thing. I think increasingly you're seeing the sort of students advocate for themselves, advocate for curriculum. This is true from a perspective of racial justice and sort of understanding decolonization and Black Lives Matter, as well as climate change. These are the problems that this generation is going to have to be solving in the world. They need the skills and the teaching and the sort of tutelage to be there. So that's just sort of my quick assessment, I suppose, of where we're at. I think we're in a moment where very quickly a lot of people and a lot of universities and students are realizing that we need to get better at how we teach about these issues, how we do so in an interdisciplinary way, and probably knock down some of the silos of academia in the meantime, so that we can actually start to find good solutions to this problem. But happy to talk more in detail about that.
That was fantastic and a perfect segue. So we mentioned we have a video from the panelists that wasn't able to join us in person tonight. So Steve, if you could actually load that up, and then I will segue us into our questions after giving a little bit more background about myself and the connections I actually have seen across our panelists this evening already. Steve? Just making sure you heard. Okay.
Yep. Technical difficulty.
Well, while we're loading that, I'll just give a little bit more about myself. So I am currently based at the Julianna Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory, which is based at Arizona State University. And talking about the history of sustainability, Arizona State University is one of the first schools of sustainability in the United States, at least at the higher education level, formal higher education level, that is. And we also proudly boasted the first Global Institute of Sustainability in the US that really deals with these synergies from education to research to practice, and really how do we move from just knowledge acquisition to knowledge in action. And so that's going to be a key point to discuss here today. But one of the things that really has driven me to this field is the idea of the interconnectivity between human environment and the kind of false dichotomies we've created between our human and natural relationship, and what it means to heal and regenerate our world from the inside out. That transformation process really needs to be at all different scales and all different levels, from the personal and collective to the systems and societal levels. And a lot of my work actually focuses on finding those synergies, facilitating that transformation at multiple scales simultaneously, and looking at it from a deep commitment to justice, from social and ecological justice perspective. So I'm really much grounded, first and foremost, in the justice elements. And that's a key thing that I want to address in terms of education as we move on to our conversation today. And in fact, the video we're about to see will touch a bit on that and kind of lay the foundation for our dialogue to come. So Steve, I'm ready if you are. I'm having trouble hearing that, so I think we may have a sound issue.
Yeah, that is, I believe, as loud as it goes. So we may have to forego the video, unfortunately.
All right. Well, I cannot do Leonides justice, and I know I just mispronounced her name again, but I did have a chance to view this video, so I can just touch a little bit of the key points that she laid out earlier. And one of the elements that I think is really important, which relates to some of the conversation that we've already begun in the introduction of each of our panelists, is about the power of mindset and the role of narratives and the way that we approach education, from not just a education of skill sets and knowledge acquisition, to one about really connecting the political to the social and ecological dimensions of our world. And looking at this from the role of how do we educate conscious and conscientious decision makers and actors in the field of climate science, climate justice, what have you, at the different roles that we may play well into the future. And she talks a lot about coherence as something that really is about bringing together these diverse disciplines, diverse ways of knowing and thinking about the world, and really recognizing the roles of justice when we talk about the value systems and human rights elements of sustainability, and how each of these are deeply interconnected. And thinking to the future, she really speaks to the idea of how we need more equal, sustainable, and safe environment for everyone. And when we talk about environment, we think more holistically about environment as us being a part of and contributing to our world. And the knowledge that's produced and the knowledge that's gained through educational activities is every much a key contributor to how we respond to climate crisis. And one of the goals that she had as she wrapped up her video message was about how we can do better at engaging with our youth and with social and ecological organizations around the world. It's a pity if we can figure out the sound issue, we might be able to play it at the end. I'll leave that to Steve to try and work on that. But in the meantime, I'm going to move on to some of the founding questions that will really get this dialogue going. So this is going to be more of a free flow dialogue. So panelists, feel free to chime in at will. There's not going to be sort of one person, everybody has to respond model, but if it speaks to you, feel free to respond. And I want to make this more conversational as we go. So one of the core questions to begin that I was hoping to raise with each of you starts with this idea of where we are at in this moment. I asked you all to think about, what excites you right now, but really in a kind of a reflection mode, can we speak to, especially each of your diverse histories and experiences in this field, how far have we come? Where are we heading? So that kind of core grounding of this moment, a really reflection on the time that we're in. So feel free, anybody, to begin that dialogue.
So I'll start just by saying that I've witnessed from the beginning of people seeing into the future and seeing that we were going to have some bumps in the road and preparing some young people for that future, to going ahead and trying to educate for sustainability, to educate about something nobody knew they needed or wanted, to spending most of my time explaining why they needed to understand all of this, to now spending all my time helping people figure out how to educate for sustainability and climate change. Nobody's asking why anymore. So for me, that was, 40, 50 years. So I think we've moved ahead. We're not in the same place. We could move faster and bigger.
So you're actually speaking a lot to a cultural shift that you've seen over the years. Am I right?
Yes, but still way too slow from my point of view. And it's really the pace of change that schools have that is slowing us up. They were not designed to change or to make change or even to educate. So we have a bit of a challenge there.
Excellent point. Anybody else want to reflect on this question?
Yeah, I really agree with that, and maybe on a much more condensed time frame than 30 or 40 years. When I was doing my master's degree in international relations about seven or 8 years ago, I was one of a very small handful of people, sort of within a large class of people studying international relations that wanted to look at environment and climate change. I think I was one of 4 within 2-year classes at CEPA at Columbia, and so it was a lonely tribe and a group of people who were really dedicated, sort of really in it for the right reasons. Now I think those numbers have just exploded. People wanting to study this topic are so numerous, and if you sort of are studying a different topic, you're absolutely looking at how climate change appeals to that. So I think it's actually, a good thing that demand signal is there. I think it's also, like, quite frankly, because people see that there are careers there. People understand that they need to know about environmental, climate, sort of international issues, because that's the world we live in today, which I think is almost more the reason that universities are saying, oh no, we need, if you're a business school, you need classes about sustainable finance and sort of climate risk. If you are, of course, a law school, you need to understand the litigation side and law and policy making. So I think we're in a space where people have sort of woken up and seen that this will define their careers wherever they are. And so you're actually sort of caught flat-footed now and not equipping yourself with the skills you need if you're not teaching yourself about this topic.
So that's really interesting, kind of this idea that the consciousness of the need is there, but we're not yet quite ready or prepared for the expansiveness of the challenges ahead of us. Is that kind of right, what you were getting at?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, we're not solving the problems yet, so clearly we're not skilling people the way we need to, but hopefully we're chipping away.
For sure. Andy, did you want to chime in at all on this question? You don't have to, by the way.
Yeah, well, definitely. I think a lot of the things that have been coming up are with regard to interdisciplinarity and how previous approaches to sustainability, and certainly this was my experience, was rooted within the sciences, rooted within technology, without enough of an understanding of the impacts that it has on other areas, as well as the complex system in which it operates. Some technological advancement needs to exist within the business market. Some scientific understanding of climate change needs to exist within the political system. And so, Kate, earlier you said something about, needing to knock down silos. And I think there are a lot of institutions doing good work moving forward on that. Jaimie, you say, institutions, especially in higher education, aren't built for quick change. And so that certainly is a challenge to meet the growing need of students who see this as an important issue to address, and finding ways to give them broad skill sets that are going to be useful for the challenges now and the growing challenges in the coming decades.
Yeah. I also would add that I think that people are tempted to admire the problem for way too long, and to educate about unsustainability more than educate for a sustainable future or a regenerative one. It's easy to, the brain wants to go to the threat. And so it generates dopamine in the brain. So people want to focus on the problems, and particularly the symptoms. Climate change is a symptom of unsustainability. So the more you focus on the symptom, the more you're going to shift the burden, make things worse over time, and create new problems. So I would just throw that out there.
I want to just center in on that point a little bit, and then I move on to a related question that's, but you triggered something that's really important about something with regards to the links between education and the direction of change that education has taken on, and sort of the cultural influences on how that transformation has happened in education. And I'm thinking more particularly, we hear a lot about kind of the climate dystopia of media and how it's framed in terms of public perception. And there's a lot of research in that space, but in terms of like climate communication in the public versus how that has really influenced the ways that we've chosen to educate in the climate sphere and for climate professions. I'm interested to hear if that's been something that you've all addressed in your work, or noticed at least in the ways that you've operated in your organizations.
Yeah, I'll give it to the others first, since I just piped up.
Well, I'd say for what we do at Minerva, we certainly are focused, and some of the initial skills that we try to teach are with respect to problem solving, which of course requires some focus on that problem itself to understand the various different dimensions of it, but then of course has to go beyond that. And so a lot of what we get into is looking at some of these challenging issues that are still have problems remaining, and not just climate issues, but also some other big global problems, to try to see what small progresses have been made in different areas and be able to capitalize on those effective solutions and be able to take that as a map for progress in other areas.
Yeah, so I actually think about this quite differently when we're talking about threats, because increasingly I work quite closely with the security community, sort of national security, defense, as well as foreign policy more broadly. And in those spaces, I think I'm actually constantly saying there are threats here nobody's paying attention to. You know, it's you wish it would be a little bit more sort of dystopian, break through the mold, but it's because I think about this purely in an educational perspective. Those people that are really at the top of national security and foreign policy did not have any exposure to climate change or environmental issues or anything sort of probably natural systems in their education or in their sort of hands-on experience in those jobs. And that's the problem, because I think we have a lot of leaders around the world that unfortunately are just blind to the deep interactions between the climate system and human systems, between the peace on the ground and everything that we know from an environmental perspective is required to maintain sort of human security and livelihoods. So I actually think, we do have a pretty good understanding of the threats, particularly in the natural sciences, in sort of the whizzes of climate modelers understanding with quite, deep sophistication where the world might go if we continue on the current trajectory. But we don't do a very good job of putting those in lay people's terms to communicate that to policymakers so that they know and know how to integrate those threats into the other work that they do.
Right.
At the same time, I think we also sort of as a society should be okay with saying, some people we're going to have to go get retrained. You might be top brass in the military and you don't know a big threat that's coming online. You might have to go learn about that and take some educational classes. And that's a good thing. It actually is expanding sort of what we know and understand as security in a way that I think is really important for the 21st century at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to add on to that idea of needing to be retrained or needing to learn additional things moving forward with such a large dynamic problem. What you know now, even if you know a lot, is likely not going to be sufficient. And so having both the attitude to attend to that need of the changing situation, as well as the abilities to go out and effectively learn in an independent way after you've gone through your higher education, is really crucial. And hopefully with new approaches to education, that's going to be more effective. Kate, you talked before about some of the generational differences in terms of approaching climate change. I hope there are, I certainly see issues currently with people taking knowledge as a fixed entity. Hopefully the newer generation won't approach things that way, and we'll see it as a living entity that they need to keep fostering themselves.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also have discovered that most of the projections, the climate projections and the modelers, of course, cities, for example, have to give us the worst case scenario. They have to plan for the worst case scenarios. But we want young people to know there's worst case scenario, and then there are other scenarios. If we do this, then what? And then what? And if we do that, and if we do this by this time, and making sure that everyone understands that there's no such thing as not making a difference. Everything we do and everything we don't do makes a difference. And so making sure that everybody knows they can and they are making a difference. Not that they can, but they are. And that each thing we do is going to shift things one way or the other. And I think that's really important, because if people think of it as we're going down that worst case scenario and that's the only scenario there is, then you get what we call the bummer mental model or mindset. And there's no reason to do anything if there's no hope. So you have to be careful of that.
Yeah, hope is a catalyst for learning. What a original thought, right? So I wanted to shift a little bit to another question that relates to this, but I think it also gets at some other dimensions. When we talk about climate education, it almost sounds as if that's like a shared understanding of what that is and how it's done. And I think that's anything but the truth. So my question to you all is, we talk about climate education, but education for whom, by whom, and for what purpose? I think it taps into some justice dimensions as well that I really hope to elevate here today.
Yeah, exactly. You guys want to go first? Shall I?
Anybody? Go ahead. You can go ahead, Jaimie.
I'll jump in. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about what people need to know in order to understand what's going on with climate change and to be able to do something about reversing global warming. So one of the things, and our Brazilian colleague, I'm sorry that she's not here, if she talks a lot about mindsets, we've spent a lot of time thinking about the mental models of unsustainability and those that can have a better shot at generating a sustainable future and contributing to that. And thinking about thinking is one of the things that I think is going to make a huge difference, because thinking drives behavior and behavior causes results. And so having a chance for everybody to be thinking about their thinking and what is the kind of thinking that's driving behavior that's undermining our future, and what does the different way of thinking look like, I think is huge. I also think being able to distinguish problems from symptoms. I work in New York City public schools and in a lot of the most challenging circumstances and the most high-end circumstances, and not too much in between, which is kind of interesting. And I think this different way of thinking is useful for everybody. In New York City, kids are very concerned about everything, unsustainability, the economy, the climate, and when they learn systems thinking strategies, for example, that can turn an entrepreneurship mindset, turning problems into opportunities to create value, it doesn't take but half a second for them to start moving in a different direction and changing their communities. And that's what I'm really hopeful about, because they're not stuck in their thinking. So those are just a couple of things. One more thing that I think people need to really understand is the simple concept of stocks and flows, which is a systems thinking concept. The stock goes up and down and the flow comes in or goes out. And you can't put more in faster than the earth can absorb. That's not that hard to understand. And conversely, you can't take out more faster than can be replenished. So both of those ideas are really simple and everybody can understand it. So I think those would be a few of the things that I would contribute to what I consider climate education.
So just one key highlight from that, the perspective taking,
yes,
is a really huge aspect of how we educate and why we educate, and the role of who's educating that really shapes that. So I think that's really important. Other thoughts from Kate or Andy?
Yeah, so I often have moments where I'm doing reading and realize that so much of what we are sort of in this new age climate world trying to teach is deep wisdom that many generations of humans had long before us. And a lot of those traditions are kept alive today in indigenous communities about how we relate to the natural world, how we as humans should interact with the full breadth of biodiversity and life and livelihood around us. And there's something so deeply simple and pure about, I think, us as modern humans struggling with how do we approach these problems, and then reading in the text or hearing sort of spoken oral traditions about generations of people that have sort of figured that out and figured out that balance. And I really lament often that so much of, I think, especially these days, in a very contemporary sense, people who are learning about climate change are doing it from a perspective of engineering the greatest new technology to get us out of this mess, or especially in the age of having to figure out how to take carbon out of the atmosphere and reverse a lot of the damage that we've done, all of this. That in a way, I feel, are we getting even further from that core deep wisdom and knowledge about how we relate to the world and trying to come up with another sort of technocratic fix to these problems that themselves were technological. So I struggle with that sometimes, and I struggle with the ease, I think, that people can sort of lean into climate change these days without having to have any exposure to deeper understandings, philosophical, mental, of human relation to the environment and what that means. So I guess, as you, Julianna, ask about who's teaching and where are they teaching and why are they teaching, it's something that we actually really need to question. Are we going to the experts on this issue? And are those experts indigenous communities or communities that have often lived in vulnerable situations, but because of that are really the most sustainable? And how can we bring those perspectives more central to the conversation is something we're really bad at, but really need to improve on.
Yeah, so you raised that point of it's not just perspectives, but how we even frame what constitutes expertise, especially in higher education, but across the sphere of sustainability and climate science. It's a huge issue, and it's really a critical question that we don't do enough discussion around, especially when we talk about decision-making and action at the top tiers of power and organizations and governments around the world, as some have commented to in our section here today. Andy, any thoughts on your end you want to add?
Yeah, definitely. Just emphasizing the importance when we ask the question for whom and by whom, it should be as broad as possible. Kate, you mentioned looking for some sort of technological solution at the global level that's overlooking all the different impacts that climate change has on so many different communities and how so many different communities have dealt with various different challenges such as this that we can learn from. And so, Julie, when you ask for whom and by whom, it really needs to be everyone, where if we have a global problem, then we can't take one perspective and have that be the leading one. That's gonna miss potential solutions, and not only potential solutions that we might generate, but those solutions, when we implement them, may not be equitable in the way that they need to be.
Right. And there is no such thing as one expert for what we're all talking about. This does require learning communities. And part of that is because we don't know what we don't know. And part of that's because we're trying to teach about something we don't actually know how to do. So it's really exciting.
We'll get to that. That's one of my follow-up questions. You're giving a little preview there. Oh. But the other thing that I want to raise that's related also to the initial question in terms of how far have we come or where are we at now, is the idea that a lot, up until recent decades, the climate problem was easily externalized by people in developed countries in terms of more of the global north that were more removed from the vulnerabilities and risks as we talk about it in climate vulnerability science. And looking at it now, when we talk about things like, just from my own country context, the US, where right next door to me in California, there's wildfires raging and people are becoming, and we haven't really recognized or put together just how present all of this is now, and the impacts that are happening now, and the urgency that you spoke about, Kate, earlier on, in what drove you to this field is, I think, a really important factor in terms of how we even think about why it's not just an expert's problem to deal with that we have to be considering as the main players in this, but that as you talked about, Andy, that it's everybody has to be a part of this. And Jaimie, you spoke about, we all are already contributing positively or negatively, but we're already doing it. So how can we do that more effectively, more intentionally, and in line with that social and ecological justice value system that we're seeking? So on that note, I'd like to carry forward on that thought process and talk about kind of the connections with this justice element, right? We're seeing that, especially if those from around the world are following what's happening in the US in recent months. This is a longstanding issue that's touched every community around the world. But what are the justice implications of the climate crisis, and how can those be better addressed in the ways that we reimagine the very role of climate education or climate learning, sustainability learning, whatever you want to call it, as we move into the future? So really connecting that justice dimension to the way that we educate. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I'll jump in and say this is partially why I think education, and obviously we probably all think this on this panel, but really is the root of everything. Like when you pull that string of a political problem, whatever it is, eventually you get to, well, what if we just taught people something different, taught them to think differently, taught them to, sort of treat Black lives with respect. And it all sort of comes back to this moment of early childhood, probably, and that experience and journey that people have as they're being educated about how to see the world. Of course, that's a very unsatisfying sort of policy or political answer, because particularly with the education system in the US and other places so messed up, it's very hard to make and get any ground sort of in that way. So I think for better or for worse, climate change is a deeply politicized issue, and it's going to be hard, especially to marry that up with the deeply politicized issue of justice, especially racial, gender, all the different types of justice that are sort of important to examine right now. But as a bright spot, I think I increasingly see students doing it themselves. I think that's the moment that you saw this summer of people having reading groups and reading lists and trading those around. Like, that's also retraining and re-educating later in life too. So even if you're not getting it on the curricula in a deep red state where, the political incentives are such that they need to ignore these problems exist, I think you see kids and teenagers and young adults all the way up saying, I'm going to take sort of autonomy in my own education and study these things. And with the internet and with all these resources at their fingertips to do so, I think it's actually exciting, especially because there are so many organizations that are dedicated to offering this for people.
Really important. And you talked earlier, Jaimie, or Kate, I think you were the one that mentioned this, the decolonizing of education. And I think that's a huge, important factor here. Yeah. Have any of you dealt with that in your own work?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I want to answer the first question first, though. For me, justice is not only something that we all deserve from a human rights point of view. It's not only ethically and morally correct and the right thing to have, but it's actually the only sustainable way to operate. From a systems point of view, if there's that much disparity and that much injustice, your system is out of whack. And the optimal state of a healthy system is dynamic equilibrium. And so even from everyone's survival point of view, without justice, none of us has a chance to move toward a sustainable future. So I think that's important for people to realize. It's not only the right thing to do, but it's an absolutely essential thing to do if we want to thrive over time, if we want to build that capability to thrive over time. The other thing I think that people miss is that one of the key enduring understandings of education for sustainability is that diversity makes complex life possible. It's not something to be tolerated. There is no life on this planet without diversity, and that's every kind of diversity. And I don't think everybody got that memo in school, and it's something everyone needs to understand right now. So I'll wait on the colonization question until Andy gets a chance to say something.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, sure. Just adding in on some of these thoughts, I think too often people have ignored how interconnected communities are, and when we think about what might be imposed by a school district that has some political agenda, I think it's amazing now how motivated young people are now, and how empowered they are to augment what they're learning and reach out to other sources that can help supplement that and help them understand the different viewpoints that can lead to greater empathy, that can lead to better action in terms of the climate, as well as a number of different issues where justice is important, be that the COVID-19 crisis or policing or various different things. And I think that also speaks to the issue brought up earlier on how
The decolonizing?
I was thinking back to something Jaimie said earlier with respect to how and sorry, I've lost my train of thought a little bit. I was trying to come up with the name Jaimie, and then it wasn't in front of me, and that threw me off. With respect to decolonization, Julie, that's something that I think is an active, growing need that people are responding to too late, but now is something that we're trying to incorporate into what we do. And that's going to have positive influences on how people are educated for climate change and responding to that, as well as other things. And actually, that brings me back to your point that I wanted to connect to, Jaimie, where you talk about a lot of these problems are symptoms of other issues, and injustice really is at the core of all of this.
And self-righteousness, I think, is one of the most upstream problems we have to deal with. Like, it's kind of an absurdity.
Well, are you speaking to the collectivist versus the individualistic perspectives of cultures, or?
When I'm thinking self-righteousness, I'm thinking of people's thinking that they're better than anybody else, whether it's another species or another human being. There always seems to be somebody that people need to put down in order to put themselves up. In every culture, there's somebody that's got the lower rung. And I don't know why that is, why we need to always put somebody down in order to rise ourselves up. I don't think we have to. I think we're in the habit of that. I'm not a big fan of thinking of these things as human nature, because we're always evolving and learning and growing and changing. But that self-righteousness is the root of a lot of wrong thinking and wrong behavior.
On that, though, too, I mean, I wanted to jump in on the decolonization point, because I think that increasingly what I've seen, and I've spoken so much about student demand, but it's quite honestly, I think, where you're seeing the pressure come from to remake a lot of these systems is students reacting against that self-righteousness of the curriculum, of the reading list, of those kind of things, and calling out the fact that it's all old white men that you're required to read, and sort of forcing academic departments, especially in universities, of course, to change and to really go out and seek and find other perspectives, other disciplines, other cultures to bring into the reading list. And I've seen it sort of in person, in all of its tension, and it's incredible. You know, students really wanting to, from the first go, explore the colonized sort of institutions that we're all living in still to this day and pick them apart, wanting to think really deep, hard questions about what we're learning and why we're learning and who decided we had to read these things. And this is in a place like the Oxford, right, which is, you're surrounded by things sort of pillaged from other countries around the world in colonial times. And I think in my mind, sort of like, finally, you have students waking up to this in this space and taking it on head on. And it's not just from the summer. I think it's been a slow and steady process up until now. But I think the credit does go to the students for sort of forcing that to happen. Now, what becomes really difficult, I think, and I speak as somebody who I feel like sort of bridged the world before we had any pressure to do that, and in this new sort of brave new world, is it can be hard, I think, of this, especially in terms of environmental or climate content, to really critique if you haven't been taught the problematic ideas that came before, right? How do you really take down the old white men if you don't very critically know what they're saying? So I think that we are in this moment of understanding we have to completely decolonize and diversify the canon, but also interacting with the fact that a lot of people still think of that as the canon, and it shapes our lives in so many ways. And I speak of the canon, but it's really just, the tradition or the reading list that defines any sort of syllabus 101 class.
Yeah, I would also add that one of the core content areas of education for sustainability is cultural preservation and transformation. And it's all about being really thoughtful about what to preserve and what needs to change in order to be sustainable. We're really good at changing what should have been preserved and preserving what should have been changed. But if we could just get that right, I think we'd have a fighting chance.
That's a beautiful comment to kind of roll us out to the end of our conversation. Our hour blew by, everybody. So I had several other questions I wanted us to get to, but perhaps a couple wrapping up comments that will connect us to really propel forward this thinking about the future of climate education. First of all, thank you to each of our panelists here. And what you've really stirred up in me are some core questions about sort of how do we address or shift education, or climate education more specifically, in the direction of healing and regenerating our institutions, our systems, and ourselves, as much as healing and regenerating our environments in which we thrive and on which we depend. So that's one key pillar, is kind of reframing or reimagining what education should be about and who should be involved in leading that. And that decolonizing education is really also about clearing the way for different perspectives, as we talked about this past hour, to really have those voices rightfully and justly brought back into the leadership of how we think about and address climate challenges around the world. The other key thing, and this is something that, Andy, I know we wanted to discuss, you in particular, about how this connects with educating for future jobs. A panel earlier this morning was about the future of work for this Day of the Climate Professional. And if we think about jobs and, the fact that a lot of these jobs, we don't even know what they're going to be into the future and what responsibilities and challenges we're going to be facing. So how do we prepare people early on? Because we talked about intergenerational learning across the life course, really starting as young as possible. And something that I like to refer to a lot about just in the learning sphere, as the type of core capacities or capabilities that are needed, one of them being adaptive capacity. How do we evolve with those changing needs in education, both from those who are the educators, but also those who are learning with you in this process, and recognizing that we're all continuously in need of learning because it's constantly changing. I want to give this last moment to the panelists just to say any final words. I know we're at time, but hopefully we won't get kicked out of here. So any final comments from our panelists? And again, thank you to everybody. Thank you to YCL and to Steve for pulling us all together today. Kasia, I know you're on there in the background. Kasia, the head of YCL, for organizing this entire event today. So just a privilege to be with you all.
Yeah, if I could jump in quickly on that idea of jobs that don't even exist yet, it really does connect to the idea of needing to be a lifelong learner and learning how to learn. And I think that relates to the canon, which is actually, I think, the most important kind of the antithesis of that idea, where if we hold something to be like the finished end state of knowledge, then that goes against the idea of being a lifelong learner. And both students need to take that perspective, as well as institutions need to take that perspective.
Yeah, agreed. And I would just add, think about your thinking and stay open-minded. And that's what our teachers were telling us in the 60s to prepare us for the 21st century. Exactly that. Learn to learn, think about your thinking, and stay open-minded, because you're going to constantly be shape-shifting your understanding of the world, and that adaptability and creativity. And I would add one more thing: the creativity, do the math, and know what a social contract is, and know how to develop them with the people in your communities, your various communities, and hold to them.
That could be a whole other panel discussion, but Kate and
great. Yeah, I feel like I should be taking notes of these words of wisdom myself. Look, I mean, it's clear that my thesis through this whole conversation has been sort of youth demand and youth action. But I think especially for the young climate leaders on this sort of audience, it is through you that change is happening. I see this every day when I sit down with the most senior policymakers that say, oh, I have to do something about this because my grandkids are pushing me to. It's there, it's in universities and in education. If you don't speak up and demand that you learn about something, that you read about something, be critical of what you are learning about and reading about, it is not going to change. And I think we're seeing so much change because people are finally speaking up in a really big way. So it's hats off to all of you, but sort of keep it up and keep that fire lit. Otherwise, we're not going to get where we need to go. And I know that I saw some really great questions in the chat about US politics and sort of presidential administrations. That's definitely what I do in my day job. Sorry, we couldn't get to them. I'm sorry, but I will say I have a piece actually coming out on this in the next couple of days. So I'll direct you there. I put my Twitter in my name. It's Kate A. Guy on Twitter, so you can find it there. But lots of exciting things on all sides of the world right now.
Yes, thank you all. And my final words are just to stay humble. All right. Have a good night, everybody. And thank you again, YCL.
Hi, great to meet you all.
Thanks, everyone. Great discussion.
Thank you.